Buried in the forests of northern Vermont, a single, tasteless drop of sap is transformed into one of the sweetest, simplest products on the planet. It's an industry that doubled its production in America in just the past decade. All of this despite significant changes in the growing season. So what's next for the sought-after sugar? The food forecast for maple syrup begins right now. I'm talking pure maple syrup, this kind, not the stuff that most of us grew up putting on our pancakes and our French toast. That's right, this actually doesn't have maple in it. I'm not allowed to show you the bottle, but let me go ahead and read the back ingredients here. We've got corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, cellulose gum, caramel color, salt, sodium benzoate, sorbic acid, artificial and natural flavors, sodium hexametaphosphate, not an ounce of maple. Pure maple syrup is just one ingredient, sap, taken from a sugar maple and boiled down. It's the same recipe since, well, forever. And forever is about how long Bob White feels like he's been making it. Before we start, please tell me how you say the word S-Y-R-U-P.
Syrup.
Syrup. Yeah. I'm right. I'm right.
So did you win a bet on this one?
No, I have been made fun of by everyone in New York City.
What do they call it there?
Syrup. They hit it real hard on the syrup. With that settled, father and son, Bob and Chris White, bring me into their luscious and tedious world of making maple syrup. Bob's been walking these woods, or what they call sugar bush, tapping these trees since 1981. And until 2 years ago, he was operating out of this 19th century sugar house. So what is this? What are we looking at?
This is the old evaporator. It's all dirty, hadn't been used in a couple of years. Steam would come out of here, just billow out of here, and pure steam everywhere. It'd rise up out of here. Well, if you didn't have that in an old sugar house, it would just be like a rainstorm in here all the time.
35 years later, Chris is helping his dad double their business, moving from that historic sugar house to this high-tech sugar operation. It's not a unique story in Vermont. Production of maple syrup in the state has grown 111% from 1992 through 2014. And 2015 was a record year for maple syrup everywhere.
It's pretty rare when you have a season where everybody has a good year.
Yeah.
So, but this year, everybody made a lot of syrup. Mm-hmm. And
that was all because of weather?
All because of weather.
The weather, you knew it had to sneak in there somehow. See, sap only flows well when you've got just the right threshold of temperature. It's got to freeze to a certain point, thaw to a certain point, and then do that back and forth for a long period of time. That slow progression into spring is exactly what you need. A nice steady progression is something they don't always get. And we know it's a short season. I mean, this is a 4 to 6 week?
We've seen it as short as 2 weeks and as long as 10 weeks.
Okay.
The 2 weeks, that's the real disaster for us.
Yeah. In 2012, Vermont had its hottest March on record, way too warm for the syrup to flow. It cut production significantly. A big deal because syrup accounts for upwards of $330 million in the state's economy. $330 million in sales, around 3,000 full-time jobs. Now you see why it's so important for Vermont to have a great maple syrup season. There's actually an entire lab dedicated to this yummy treat. That's Abby Vandenberg. She's a researcher at the University of Vermont's Proctor Maple Research Lab in Underhill, Vermont. Their most recent research shows that season is shifting.
You can actually see that the season has changed. So the season is starting earlier, which is not too surprising, but it's also ending earlier. So the season is decreasing in length over time, and over the past 45 years, it's decreased by over 3 days, which when you think of a really short season like maple production, which is about 6 weeks long, 3 days is a pretty significant portion of that season. So getting warmer earlier and then getting too warm for maple production earlier.
That is a lot of info. So what she's saying is that the season is getting shorter because it's getting warmer faster. But how is it then that they're making more maple syrup than ever if the season's shorter? Well, first, we have to find out how sap works. So let me take you back to science class to really break this down. The tree has to make sugar to grow. Remember photosynthesis? Yeah, well, once the light is turned into sugar, it's processed and stored in that tree. The fine branches at the top of the tree begin freezing. That freezing creates little ice crystals. The ice forming compresses gas-filled cells that build up pressure, drawing water up through the roots. When the temperatures fluctuate above and below freezing, all of a sudden you have this water that's been brought up against the force of gravity and frozen in the tree. You have head pressure, like water standing in a pipe. The pressure then is higher inside the tree than outside the tree, and when you put a hole in it, the sap comes out. Still confused? Don't be. Check this out. Pretend the straw is the tree. So the ice crystals are forming up here, drawing up that water. Sap's created. It's there. It's higher pressure inside the tree than there is out. They tap, and out it comes. So get this, it was super labor intensive. Those guys used to tap the tree, into a bucket it would go. The sap then had to be brought to a central location where they would boil it over a fire in the woods.
And the dark amber.
And that's thicker too.
Not thicker.
No?
No.
Is that just my mind
It just
playing?
tastes. It's psychology. You think it's thicker, but it's not.
Burr Morris's family carried those buckets. They've been sugaring in Vermont since the late 1700s. Seventh generation sugar. Is that how you say it?
Sugar maker.
Sugar maker.
The term is still sugaring instead of syruping because the pioneers, my ancestors, were making the product and boiling it all the way to maple sugar. Sugar from the south started coming in and rendering maple sugar too expensive, so they had to come up with a whole new product. They started boiling it less and calling it maple syrup.
Today, technology has changed everything.
The primary use of vacuum is when you have a freeze-thaw cycle, the tree pressurizes itself. And as it's thawing, as that's when the pressure goes, it actually forces the sap out of the tree. When you don't have a freeze-thaw, if you can apply a little bit of vacuum to it, it'll start flowing in. The more vacuum you apply, the more it'll flow.
Today, they can get more than a half gallon per tree in a season. Here's how it works. A tree is tapped in the late winter.
There you go. Yep. So
The sap runs through miles of tubing.
they all come into this as what's called a vacuum releaser.
This spring we had sap flowing into these here at about 6,000 gallons an hour.
Straight into the reverse osmosis machine.
It is nothing more than a fancy filter, a real high-tech filter.
1,000 gallons goes in and 100 gallons comes out that we actually have to boil.
So these are what we call our concentrate tanks. What comes up here is the sap that we're ready to process in the evaporator.
On the biggest runs of the season, we'll fill these tanks 2 to 3 times.
And then heads down to the evaporator.
This is really where the magic of sugaring happens. It's not just sweet water, it's maple syrup.
Into the 40-gallon barrels and out for sale.
The barrels you see in front of you here represent about 400 or 500 acres of production in a year.
The headline this year was this was the best production year ever. So just across the board, a great weather year.
Well, it was a great weather year, but the big production also had to do with the increase in the number of taps.
We're getting just as much sap as my grandfather did, but we're having to do it different ways.
So efficiency has come in.
Yeah.
Where, you know, if this were 100 years ago, they wouldn't necessarily have been able to keep up with that.
Yeah, if people were still only collecting sap from, with buckets on trees, we might be feeling a larger impact of that reduction in the length of the seasons.
In those years that they don't produce enough syrup because of the weather, all these sugar makers have some sort of built-in insurance. Bottom line, they say it's a family thing.
One of the things that I value most about, I guess I don't want to say just following in my father's footsteps, but being a part of this industry with him is that we get to do this together. This is something that we've built together. It just didn't happen overnight. It was something that took decades to do, and this sort of progression to where we are now.
Something Burr says can only happen in one place.
It's just kind of magical, I think. As I said, I think everything comes together to make perfect sugaring conditions happen more often in Vermont than any other state.
I'm Ginger Z, and that's your food forecast for maple syrup.